The wind howled through the desolate plains, biting through his coat and pressing the weight of 1,000 unspoken things into his chest. His horse plodded wearily over the snow-packed earth, the hooves sinking into the ice with a heavy rhythm that matched his thoughts. He had ridden for days across bitter stretches of land, searching for her, the woman who owed him a debt. He had thought it would be easy, a simple matter of collecting what was owed, the kind of debt that one could settle in a few words, a few coins, and then be done with it. But as he neared the small frozen town of Sweetwater, the quiet dread in his gut told him that things would never be that simple. Lydia Holloway, that was the name. Once she had been a woman who had taken a hand, offered a kind word, and promised the stars. But promises had a way of crumbling, and the stars, in her case, had fallen far and hard. He remembered the last time he had seen her, a woman with eyes full of fire, a heart full of hope. But that was before the town had branded her, before they had turned her into something less than human, before they had decided that she owed them something greater than any woman could repay. Now he was here, a man of few words, no friends, and a debt to collect. His hand rested on the grip of his revolver, a comfort he didn't need, but one he couldn't shake. The air was still, the kind of cold that went all the way to the bone. There were no sounds here, just the whisper of the wind and the echo of his thoughts. As he approached the small cabin at the edge of town, he saw her standing there, Lydia, her back hunched against the cold, her hair hidden beneath a worn shawl. The lines on her face were deeper now, but the fire still burned in her eyes. He could see it even from here, the faint shimmer of something once alive, still refusing to die. "Lydia," he called out, his voice rough, like gravel underfoot. She didn't turn at first, as if she didn't recognize the sound of his voice. But then, slowly, she did. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. The wind stilled, and everything fell silent, as though the land itself had been waiting for this moment. "You came," she said softly, her voice a whisper carried by the cold. "I didn't think you would." "I didn't want to," he said, "but you owe me." Her face twitched, a shadow crossing it. The smile she had once worn, the one full of promise, was gone. Now there was only weariness, the kind of weariness that came from years of regret, from the slow erosion of a person's soul. "You've come for what's owed," she said, her words heavy with an understanding of something deeper than mere money. "But you don't know what that means." He frowned, dismounting his horse slowly. "It means you owe me, and I've come to collect." Her gaze hardened. "You think you can collect anything from me?" She took a step back, her hands clenching into fists, her breath visible in the frigid air. "You think the debt I owe can be paid with anything you've got?" The wind blew cold between them, but it was her words that cut through him. A part of him knew she wasn't wrong. The debt she owed wasn't one he could collect so easily. It wasn't a debt that could be measured in money or even promises. It was something else, something far deeper. "You owe me, Lydia," he said again, but this time his voice wavered. The weight of her eyes on him made it harder to hold on to the anger, harder to keep the sharp edge of his resolve. "You owe me for the trust you broke, for the friendship you threw away." Her face softened, but just barely. "And what about the trust you broke?" she asked quietly. "What about the things you left behind?" He looked away, ashamed of the weight of his own guilt. He hadn't meant to leave her like that. He hadn't meant to walk away. But sometimes life took you in different directions, and the roads weren't always kind. "I came back," he said finally, "and now I'm here to settle what's owed." She shook her head, but her shoulders slumped, as though the weight of everything, of the past, of their shared history, was finally too much to bear. "You don't get it," she said, her voice quieter now. "There's no payment for this. Not from me, not from you." There was a long pause. The cold pressed in, and in the distance he could hear the faint howl of a wolf, a reminder that the wilderness would always be there, unforgiving, relentless. "Why did you come back?" Lydia's voice was almost a whisper now, fragile but full of a deep sorrow that reached into the cowboy's chest. He didn't have an answer to that, not one that would make sense to her, and maybe not one that made sense to him either. "I came because you owe me, Lydia," he repeated, his voice steadying. "And I don't know what you're running from, but I'm not leaving without what's owed." Her eyes hardened again. "And what will you do when you get it?" she asked, her tone bitter. "What happens when you finally get what you think you deserve?" He didn't know how to answer that, but he did know one thing. He had to get it, no matter the cost. The air was thick with silence, but the tension between them was a loud, pulsing thing. Lydia's gaze never wavered, her defiance clear in her stiff posture. But there was something else too, a certain emptiness that hung around her like a cloak. The cowboy felt it press against him, a weight heavier than the one on his chest. She had nothing left, but it was clear that whatever she was hiding, whatever she had been running from, was about to come to light. This was more than a debt to be settled. This was something far darker, something he had never anticipated. "You think I owe you, cowboy?" Lydia's voice cut through the thick, cold silence. "You think a few words and a gun make things right? Make up for everything?" His jaw clenched. She was right, but it didn't matter. He had come too far to turn back now. "You owe me the truth," he said, his words biting. "For every lie you told, for every damn minute you wasted. You owe me that much, Lydia." Her eyes narrowed. The fire he remembered flickering again, though it was a dim, weary flame. "And what if the truth is something you don't want to hear?" Her voice dropped lower, each word carrying a weight he wasn't prepared for. "What if I told you that I've already paid every price that could be asked of me, every single one?" He stepped forward, drawn by the sorrow in her words, the rawness beneath the defiance. He had known pain. He had known loss. But this was different. The weight of her confession hung in the air like a fog, pressing against him until he couldn't breathe. "Then I'd still take the truth, Lydia," he said quietly, his voice shaking for the first time. "Even if it's a price that's too high to pay." Her lips trembled as she looked away, the sting of his words sharp enough to cut through the thick, cold silence between them. "You've already paid a price," she murmured. "Just not in the way you think." The words echoed in his chest, and for a moment he felt like a fool, standing there with his gun on his hip and his chest heavy with old wounds. He had come to collect a debt, but it wasn't just money or promises. The debt was wrapped up in pain, in lies, in things that could never be fully paid. "I didn't want this," she said, more to herself than to him, her eyes lost in the past. "I didn't want any of it, but I didn't have a choice. I never had a choice." The cowboy was silent. He could feel the truth crawling beneath his skin, but he wasn't sure he was ready to face it. She wasn't just a woman with a debt. She was a woman who had been broken, who had lost everything, and somehow he had become part of that loss. He hadn't known it then, but the past had a way of catching up to you. "I was trying to protect her," Lydia whispered, so quietly that he almost didn't hear her. "I was trying to keep Grace safe, but I failed. And now I'm the one who's going to pay for it. For everything." The cowboy's heart stilled. Grace. The name hung in the air between them like a forgotten prayer. "What happened to her?" he asked, his voice suddenly hoarse. The answer he feared was already starting to form in his mind, but he needed her to say it. Lydia's face twisted in pain, and for a moment, she was just a woman again. A mother, broken and scared, not the strong, defiant figure she had tried to become. Her shoulders slumped, and she took a step back, as if the weight of her own confession was more than she could bear. "The preacher," she said, her words barely audible. "He took her. They all did. I thought I could save her. I thought I could protect her from everything, but I couldn't. They made sure of it." The cowboy felt a cold rush of anger fill his veins. The preacher. He had heard whispers about him, about his power in this town, about how he controlled not just the people, but their souls. But to hear it from Lydia, to hear that her daughter had been taken from her by the very man who had ruined her life, something inside him broke. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice steady again, but with an edge that cut deep. "Where's Grace? What have they done with her?" Lydia looked at him, her eyes filled with regret and fear. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know anymore. But if you're going after him, you'll have to go through the town, through everything he's built." The cowboy felt the weight of her words like a hammer striking his chest. This wasn't going to be easy. Nothing about this was going to be simple. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't leaving until Grace was safe. Until Lydia had some piece of her life back, even if it meant tearing this town apart in the process. "You said it yourself," he said, his voice low but determined. "I came here to collect what's owed, and I'm not leaving without it." The wind picked up again, swirling around them, but Lydia didn't answer him. She didn't need to. Her silence was enough. He turned toward the town, his mind already racing with plans. The preacher was the key. If he could find him, if he could force the truth out of him, then maybe, just maybe, they could bring Grace back. But there was something else. Something Lydia hadn't said. A part of the story that still lay hidden in the shadows, waiting to come to light. And when it did, it would change everything. Subscribe now to discover the truth behind the preacher's hold on the town. The night air grew colder as the cowboy and Lydia walked toward the heart of Sweetwater. The town, once a quiet, hard-working place, now felt like a town swallowed by shadows. The quiet buildings loomed like forgotten ghosts, their windows dark and uninviting. The sound of their boots crunching in the snow was the only noise, but it felt too loud in the oppressive silence. Lydia walked beside him, her face tight, eyes distant, as if the very act of stepping back into this place had begun to tear open old wounds. Her body was rigid, the same way it had been when they'd first met, guarded, distant, ready to push away anyone who dared get too close. But the cowboy could feel the weight of her fear. It was a heavy thing, dragging behind her like an anchor. She was afraid of facing the preacher, afraid of the town that had once been her home, a place that had turned against her so quickly, so violently. "You don't have to come with me," the cowboy said, his voice low. "I'll find Grace. I'll bring her back. You don't need to walk into that hell again." Lydia didn't look at him. "I don't have a choice," she said softly, but there was steel in her voice. "She's my daughter, no matter what they did to me. She's mine. I won't leave her in their hands." The cowboy nodded. There was no reasoning with her on this. He knew what it was like to have a bond so strong, so relentless, that nothing would tear it apart. The past wasn't something you could outrun. They made their way to the heart of the town, to the church that loomed in the distance. It was perched on a small hill, its towering steeple cutting into the dark sky like a jagged knife. The church had been built with pride, its stone walls weathered, but standing firm against the elements. But it wasn't the church that held the power now. It was the man who had made it his kingdom, the preacher. As they approached the church, the air around them seemed to thicken. The wind died down, and the night felt heavier, almost suffocating. The cowboy could feel something pressing against him, an unseen force that made him want to turn back, to run away. He didn't know if it was fear or something else, something older, deeper, more twisted than anything he had ever known. But Lydia kept walking, her head held high despite the tremble in her step, as though she were walking toward a reckoning, the preacher's reckoning. "I never thought I'd come back here," Lydia murmured, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I never thought I'd face him again. But I have no choice. He took Grace. He took everything I had left." The cowboy's hand tightened around his revolver, the cold steel comforting against his palm. He hadn't come this far to back down now. He would confront the preacher, force the truth out of him, and he would get Grace back, no matter the cost. They reached the steps of the church, the cowboy's boots scraping against the stone as he climbed. The doors were closed, but there was a faint light glowing from within, spilling out beneath the edges. A low murmur of voices reached his ears, as if the preacher had already begun his work, and it was work that the cowboy wasn't about to let him finish. Without a word, he pushed the heavy wooden doors open, the creak of the hinges loud in the still night. The inside of the church was dimly lit, the soft flicker of candles casting long shadows across the wooden pews. The air inside was thick, heavy with the scent of incense and something darker, something that felt like it had soaked into the very walls of the building over years of secrets and sins. At the front of the church stood the preacher, his back to them as he faced the altar. His tall, lean figure was silhouetted against the candlelight, the collar of his long coat high, his hands folded in front of him. He stood with the air of someone who owned everything, someone who had power over life and death in this town. "Lydia!" The preacher's voice broke the silence like a sharp blade. He didn't turn to face them. "I knew you'd come back. Eventually. You always do." Lydia's face hardened, and the cowboy could see the fear flicker behind her eyes. She took a step forward, and the cowboy stayed by her side, his eyes locked on the preacher. The preacher finally turned to face them, and the cowboy's heart skipped a beat. The preacher's face was gaunt, his eyes dark, sunken. But there was something else in his gaze, something cold and calculating, something that made the cowboy feel like he was standing in the presence of something far worse than a man. You've come for her, the preacher said softly, a dark smile curling at the corner of his lips. But you'll never find her. She's already mine. And you are too late. Lydia's breath caught in her throat, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she stood tall, her hands clenched at her sides. You don't own me, and you don't own my daughter, she said, her voice low but fierce. You never did. The preacher's smile faded, his eyes narrowing with a cold, venomous glare. You think I don't know what you are, Lydia? You think I don't know your secrets? I've been watching you, watching both of you. The cowboy stepped forward, his revolver ready. Where is she? He demanded, his voice low and dangerous. What have you done with Grace? The preacher's laugh echoed through the church, cruel and hollow. She's in a place you can't reach, he said. She's safe. Safe from you. Safe from the world you've created. I'm the only one who can save her now. Lydia's face twisted with rage. You're lying, she spat. You took her. You took everything from me, and I'm going to make sure you pay for it. The preacher's gaze flickered toward her, his smile returning. You still don't understand, do you? This town, this place, it's all part of the game. And you, Lydia, you're just a pawn. The cowboy's jaw clenched. He had heard enough. I'm done talking, he said, his voice cold as steel. I'm getting her back, and if you try to stop me, I'll make sure you regret it. The preacher's smile never faltered. You can try, he said softly, but you'll never win, not against me. And in that moment, the cowboy knew the truth. This wasn't just a fight for a woman's daughter. This was a fight for something much darker, something buried deep in Sweetwater, something that neither he nor Lydia could fully comprehend yet. The preacher's words hung heavy in the air, thick with the weight of an unspoken truth that neither Lydia nor the cowboy could ignore. They stood there, facing him, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows that stretched across the cold stone floor of the church. The tension was so thick that it seemed to press down on their chests, the air suffocating and heavy with anticipation. You still don't understand, do you? The preacher's voice was soft, almost patronizing, but there was a cruel edge to it that made the cowboy's blood run cold. This is bigger than you, bigger than your little girl, bigger than the debt you think you're owed. This town, it's mine, and you are nothing but a stray dog in a pen full of wolves. Lydia's hand trembled at her side, but she didn't back down. You're wrong. You don't control me, and you don't control my daughter, she spat, her voice laced with a fire that hadn't been there when they first entered the church. The preacher's smile was slow, like he had been expecting this. I don't control you, Lydia. I never did. You gave yourself to me, just like everyone else. The debt you owe, the price you've paid, it's all part of the plan. The cowboy took a step forward, his boots scraping the cold stone floor. His hand hovered near his revolver, the tension in his muscles evident. He wasn't sure what kind of game the preacher was playing, but one thing was clear. They weren't going to walk out of this church until they knew exactly where Grace was and how to take her back. Where is she? He demanded, his voice low and dangerous. I won't ask again. The preacher's smile never faltered, but his eyes darkened. Grace is in the place she belongs, he said, his voice smooth, like syrup. She's being protected, shielded from a world that would tear her apart. She's in a place where no one can hurt her, not even you. Lydia gasped, her eyes wide with disbelief. You You've hidden her. You've kept her from me." The preacher tilted his head, almost as if he pitied her. "I've kept her safe, Lydia. From you. From this world. You can't see it, but I'm doing this for her. For all of you." The cowboy took another step, his fist clenched tight. "You don't get to decide what's best for her," he growled. "You don't get to play God." "I don't have to play God, cowboy," the preacher said, his voice growing colder, sharper. "I am God here. This town, these people, they all belong to me. They always have. And your precious little girl, she belongs to me too." The words hit Lydia like a slap, and for a moment she faltered. She had spent so many years trying to convince herself that there was still hope, still a way to save Grace. But standing here, in the preacher's cold, calculating gaze, the truth was becoming painfully clear. The cowboy felt the weight of the preacher's words settle over him, but he refused to back down. "I don't care what kind of power you think you have over this town," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "but I'll tear this place apart to get her back. You'll have to kill me first." The preacher's expression darkened, the smirk fading from his face. "You don't know who you're dealing with, cowboy. You think you can just waltz in here, make demands, and walk out with what you want. This is no simple town. No simple place. This is where your past catches up to you." Lydia's eyes darted to the preacher's face, confusion clouding her features. "What do you mean?" The preacher's smile returned, but it was the smile of a man who had been watching for too long, a man who had orchestrated everything in the shadows. "The price you've paid, Lydia, the choices you made when you first arrived in Sweetwater, they all led to this. And you, cowboy," he turned to the man beside her, "you've walked into a game that was never meant for you." The cowboy felt a cold chill run through him. The preacher's words hit home harder than he expected. He had known this wasn't going to be easy. He had known that the preacher held power here. But now it was becoming clear that they were playing by different rules, rules they hadn't understood until now. "You're too late," the preacher said, his voice softening, almost regretful. "Grace is already a part of something much bigger than you can understand. There are forces at work here that you can't fight. The town, my followers, the things we've been building for years, you can't stop it." Lydia stepped forward, her expression raw, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "You've destroyed my life. You've taken everything from me. And now you'll take her too? You can't have her. Not again." The preacher's gaze hardened, and for a moment it seemed as though he was looking at her not with pity, but with something darker. "She's not yours to take anymore, Lydia. She never was." There it was, the final blow. The truth that Lydia had been avoiding for years, that Grace was no longer her daughter, in the way she had believed. The preacher had twisted everything, used their bond, and now she had become part of something that couldn't be undone. The cowboy could see the realization dawning in her eyes, the weight of the loss settling on her shoulders like a shroud. But he wasn't going to let this be the end, not without a fight. "Enough," he said, his voice cold and final. "We're taking her back." The preacher's eyes narrowed. "You'll try, but you'll fail." The cowboy didn't wait for another word. He turned to Lydia, his hand gripping hers tightly. "Let's go," he said, his voice firm, resolute. "We'll find a way. We'll take back what's ours." Lydia's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but there was fire in her gaze. She nodded, and together they turned toward the door. But as they stepped into the night, the sound of the preacher's voice followed them, like a shadow that wouldn't let go. "You'll never leave this place. It's too late for you both." And with that, the door slammed shut behind them. The cold air hit them as soon as they stepped outside, but it was a relief. The suffocating darkness of the preacher's church lingered in their lungs, and the silence of the night now felt almost liberating. The cowboy's grip on Lydia's hand tightened as they walked, his boots crunching through the snow, the weight of everything pressing down on him. They weren't out of danger yet. Far from it. Lydia's face was pale, her eyes wide and lost, but there was a flicker of something else there now. Determination. She wasn't just a broken woman anymore. She was a mother. And mothers fought for their children with a strength that couldn't be matched. "We need to leave," Lydia whispered, her voice urgent. "We need to get Grace out of here." The cowboy nodded. He wasn't sure how much time they had before the preacher's men came for them. But they had one thing going for them. The preacher didn't know the town as well as they did. They'd been here before. They knew the streets, they knew the people. But as they made their way deeper into Sweetwater, the town seemed different somehow. The streets were too quiet, too still. It was as if the town was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. The cowboy's gut twisted. Something wasn't right. Lydia stopped in her tracks, her eyes scanning the town. "It's all connected," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "The preacher, the sheriff, the people who run this place, they're all part of it." He didn't need her to explain. He had been sensing it too. The strange sense of power that seemed to hang over Sweetwater like an invisible force, pulling the strings of everything and everyone. "This isn't just about Grace," Lydia continued, her voice thick with emotion. "This is about control. It's about the power they've built, the things they've done to this town. The preacher, he's not the only one pulling the strings." The cowboy's heart raced. He had suspected as much. The preacher wasn't working alone. There were others in Sweetwater who had helped him keep his grip on the town. The sheriff, the mayor, the townsfolk who turned a blind eye to everything the preacher did. "Who else is involved?" he asked, his voice hardening. "Tell me." Lydia hesitated, but only for a moment. She was already on the edge, teetering between the past and the present, between the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming. "The sheriff," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of truth. "He's in on it. He's one of the preacher's followers. They've been working together for years." The cowboy's hand instinctively moved toward his revolver, the cold steel a familiar comfort. "The sheriff?" Lydia nodded, her expression one of reluctant resignation. "He's one of the preacher's enforcers. He's the one who makes sure that anyone who tries to stand up to the preacher gets shut down. And if that doesn't work, he makes them disappear." The cowboy's blood ran cold. The sheriff was no simple lawman. He was a part of the preacher's twisted network. And that meant they couldn't trust anyone in this town. "You're telling me the whole town's corrupt?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Lydia shook her head, her eyes distant. "Not everyone. There are still some who aren't part of it. But they're too afraid to speak out, too afraid to fight back. The preacher and his followers have too much control. They've taken everything from me. And now they're taking Grace." The cowboy clenched his jaw. He didn't care about the politics of Sweetwater or about who was involved in the preacher's scheme. All he cared about was getting Grace back, getting Lydia's life back. He would burn this town to the ground if he had to. "Where do we go now?" he asked, his eyes scanning the town, every corner, every shadow. Lydia didn't hesitate. "There's a hidden way out, a tunnel beneath the old mill. It's the only way to get past the sheriff and the preacher's men without them noticing. But we have to move fast." The cowboy nodded, his mind already racing with plans. The mill wasn't far from here, but if they didn't hurry, they'd be caught in the open. The preacher's men would be looking for them, and once they realized Lydia was with him, they would stop at nothing to drag her back. "You lead the way," he said, his voice steady. "I'll cover you." Lydia nodded, her face set in grim determination. She turned and began to walk, leading him toward the edge of town. The cowboy stayed close behind her, his senses alert, his hand never straying far from his revolver. As they passed through the narrow streets, the cowboy couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The silence of Sweetwater was unsettling now. It wasn't just the usual quiet of a small town. It was the kind of silence that came from fear of what was coming. They reached the old mill, the structure looming in the distance, its silhouette dark against the night sky. It was a decaying relic, from a time long past, abandoned and forgotten by most, but still standing strong, like a monument to the past. Lydia led them to the back of the mill, where the entrance to the tunnel lay hidden beneath a pile of old wooden crates. She moved quickly, her hands shaking slightly as she pushed the crates aside, revealing a small, narrow passageway. "This is it," she said, her voice tight. "We go through here, and it'll take us out of town." The cowboy didn't hesitate. He moved to follow her into the tunnel, but just as he took his first step, he heard it. The sound of footsteps behind them, heavy and deliberate. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. They were too late. Lydia's eyes widened, panic flickering across her face. "They're here. They've found us." The cowboy didn't waste another second. He grabbed Lydia's arm, pulling her toward the tunnel entrance, but the footsteps were getting closer. He could hear the sound of boots hitting the pavement, the unmistakable sound of men coming toward them. "We don't have time," he said, his voice urgent. "Get in the tunnel, now!" But before Lydia could respond, the sound of a voice rang out, sharp and clear, cutting through the night. "Stop right there!" The cowboy's heart raced as the voice echoed across the empty street, a command that sent a jolt of fear through both him and Lydia. They had no time to argue, no time to think, just time to act. "Move!" he barked, his voice sharp, as he shoved Lydia ahead of him into the narrow tunnel. The walls closed in around them as they stumbled forward, the cold, damp air filling their lungs. Lydia's breath came in ragged gasps, but she didn't hesitate. They didn't have a choice. The sound of boots on snow grew louder, closer. The preacher's men hot on their heels. The tunnel was narrow, dark, and cramped, the walls slick with moisture. Every step felt like it might be their last. "We need to hurry," the cowboy growled, his grip tight around Lydia's arm as they pushed forward. The tunnel curved slightly, leading them further into the darkness, away from the chaos of Sweetwater. But the tunnel was long, too long, and the sound of footsteps behind them told him they weren't getting far enough, fast enough. Lydia's voice was tight, filled with fear and resolve. "I can't outrun them. I can't do this." "You don't have to," the cowboy said, his voice calm despite the fear twisting in his gut. "Just keep moving. We're almost there." They rounded a sharp corner, and for a brief moment the tunnel opened into a small cavern-like space. The faintest light filtered through cracks in the stone, casting eerie shadows across the walls. They were close. The way out was just ahead. But then the sound of shouting echoed down the tunnel, cutting through the stillness. They had reached the entrance to the town. The only thing standing between them and freedom was the final stretch. But that final stretch was rapidly shrinking. The cowboy stopped, pulling Lydia close to him. He could feel the weight of her fear pressing against him, and it fueled his own anger. They weren't going to be caught. Not now. "Lydia," he said, his voice low and urgent, "you have to trust me. We're almost there. Just one more push." She nodded, but her eyes were wide, panic filling them. "What if they catch us?" "They won't," he said firmly. "We'll fight if we have to. We'll do whatever it takes." He looked toward the opening of the tunnel, just a few more steps, but he could already hear the pounding of footsteps. They weren't going to make it out without a fight. The cowboy turned back to Lydia, his eyes locking onto hers. "Go. I'll cover you." Lydia hesitated, her fear a tangible thing, but she didn't argue. She knew as well as he did that they had run out of time. He turned, crouching low as the voices of the preacher's men grew louder, closer. He could see the faint outlines of their figures in the distance, their torches flickering in the darkness. The cowboy's hand moved instinctively to his revolver. He wasn't going to let them take her. He wasn't going to let them take Grace or anyone else, ever again. Lydia took a deep breath, her feet moving quickly but carefully as she moved toward the opening of the tunnel. The cowboy stood at the ready, his revolver drawn, waiting for the moment he would have to make his stand. Just as Lydia reached the light, a figure appeared in the tunnel ahead of her. The cowboy's heart skipped a beat. The preacher's man, the sheriff. "Get back!" the cowboy shouted, his voice loud and commanding. "Don't take another step." The sheriff sneered, his eyes gleaming with that same cold, hollow malice the preacher had shown them. "You think you can stop this?" he said, his voice low and threatening. "You're too late, cowboy. We've already won." The cowboy's grip tightened on his revolver. "You haven't won anything," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "And you're not going to." The sheriff reached for his gun, but the cowboy was faster. The sound of gunfire cracked through the air, followed by a sharp cry as the sheriff staggered back, clutching his shoulder. "You should have stayed out of this," the cowboy muttered, his voice cold with finality. Lydia, her eyes wide with shock, looked back at him. You shot him." The cowboy didn't answer. He was already moving, pulling her into the light, his eyes scanning the night for any more threats. But the street was empty now. The sound of the preacher's men was gone. "Let's go," he said, his voice firm as they stepped out of the tunnel and into the snow-covered world beyond. They weren't safe yet, but they were free. For now. As they made their way toward the edge of Sweetwater, the cowboy couldn't help but look back at the church, in the distance. The preacher had promised them they couldn't win. He had promised them that Sweetwater would be their prison forever. But the cowboy wasn't done yet. Neither was Lydia. The preacher had underestimated them both, and that, in the end, would be his undoing.